Tucked away in the heart of Appalachia, the town of Havenbrook clung to its old ways. Its population never seemed to change, always around 300 souls, and neither did its weathered appearance. White clapboard houses leaned under the weight of years, and the single road into town was as cracked and narrow as it had been since the 1940s. What made Havenbrook peculiar wasn't just its isolation, it was the silence. No birds sang in the trees, and no insects buzzed in the long grass. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Visitors rarely came, and the townsfolk didn't mind. But sometimes, Havenbrook reached out and chose its own visitors. A dead engine. Mark Weaver was one such visitor. Driving cross-country on a late November evening, he found himself lost in the winding backroads of West Virginia. His old truck coughed once, twice, and then died entirely as he rounded a bend into Havenbrook. "Of course," Mark muttered, slamming his fist against the steering wheel. He popped the hood and inspected the engine, but the tangle of wires and metal meant little to him. A light glowed faintly in the distance. Grabbing his flashlight and backpack, Mark decided to walk into town. The air grew colder as he approached, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones. The streets of Havenbrook were eerily quiet, the houses dark save for a few dimly lit windows. At the center of town, a large fountain stood dry and cracked, its centerpiece a stone figure of a woman holding a broken urn. "Hello?" Mark called out, his voice echoing in the emptiness. A man emerged from the shadows, his face gaunt and pale. "Truck trouble?" he asked in a flat tone. Mark nodded. "Yeah, can you point me to a mechanic?" The man's lips pressed into a thin line. "We don't get many visitors." "I can see that," Mark said with a nervous chuckle, "but someone's got to know how to fix an engine." The man gestured toward a small house at the edge of town. "Try Mr. Harlan, he's good with machines." The warning. Mr. Harlan turned out to be an elderly man with trembling hands and eyes that darted nervously. As he tinkered with Mark's truck the next morning, he spoke in hushed tones. "You should leave as soon as this is fixed," he said, not meeting Mark's gaze. "I don't plan on sticking around," Mark replied. Harlan glanced over his shoulder as if expecting someone, or something, to be listening. "No one ever does." Mark frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Harlan wiped his hands on a rag, his expression grim. "This town has a way of holding on to people. You'd do well not to linger after sundown." A town without time. Mark wandered the town while Harlan worked, trying to shake the unease that had settled over him. The residents were odd. They stared too long and spoke too little. A woman sweeping her porch stopped mid-motion as he passed, her eyes following him until he turned the corner. A group of children stood silently in a yard, their game forgotten as they watched him with blank expressions. The town itself felt wrong. Despite the chill in the air, there were no fallen leaves on the ground, and the trees were full but motionless. Time seemed suspended, as though Havenbrook existed in a bubble, untouched by the world outside. The old chapel. At the edge of Havenbrook stood an abandoned chapel. Its doors hung crooked on rusted hinges, and its steeple leaned dangerously to one side. Mark hesitated before stepping inside. The air inside the chapel was thick and stifling, and the faint scent of mildew mixed with something metallic. Pews were scattered and broken, but the altar remained intact. On the altar lay a book bound in cracked leather. Curious, Mark opened it, flipping through pages covered in spidery handwriting. The text was a mix of Latin and something he didn't recognize, but the images were clear. Strange symbols, figures bowing before a towering shadow, and a stone woman holding an urn, just like the statue in the town square. A chill ran down his spine as he realized the urn in the drawing wasn't broken. The shadows awaken. As dusk fell, Mark returned to find his truck running and Mr. Harlan waiting with a grim expression. "You need to go. Now," Harlan said, shoving the keys into Mark's hand. "What's going on in this town?" Mark demanded. Harlan grabbed his arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "Leave. Don't ask questions. Don't look back." Mark hesitated, but something in Harlan's voice sent a jolt of fear through him. He climbed into his truck and started driving, but as he reached the town's edge, his headlights caught movement. Figures were emerging from the shadows. Their forms were indistinct as though they were made of smoke, but their eyes glowed faintly. They stood silently, watching as Mark's truck passed. The road that looped. Mark drove for miles, but the road twisted and turned until he was back in Havenbrook. His heart sank as he recognized the cracked fountain in the square. No, 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 he muttered, gripping the steering wheel. He tried again, taking a different route, but no matter where he turned, the road always led back to Havenbrook. The third time, his truck stalled again. The headlights flickered, and the engine died. Mark sat in the darkness, the silence pressing in on him. Then he heard it, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from all around. The truth of Havenbrook. The townsfolk emerged from their homes, their faces pale and expressionless. They surrounded Mark, their movements slow and deliberate. "What do you want from me?" Mark shouted. An older woman stepped forward, her voice cold and detached. "You've been chosen. Havenbrook needs you." "Chosen for what?" "To feed the Hollow One," she replied, pointing toward the chapel. The shadows closed in, and Mark's screams echoed through the empty streets. A new visitor. The next morning, Havenbrook looked the same as it always had. Quiet, still, and forgotten by the world. The fountain stood in the square, its stone woman holding an urn that was no longer broken. A week later, a traveller driving through the Appalachian backroads found himself stranded when his car inexplicably died. Havenbrook was waiting. The town of Hollow Pines wasn't on any major map. Tucked into a forgotten stretch of the Pacific Northwest, it was hidden behind a thick wall of evergreens. The town had its quirks: no streetlights, a single narrow road in or out, and an unusual number of missing person reports. But for the residents, Hollow Pines was home. It wasn't until the summer of 1986 that anyone started asking questions about what lay beneath the town. A stranger in town. The stranger arrived on a Tuesday, driving a rusted station wagon that looked like it had been dragged through a war. His name was Edward Finch, and he called himself a travelling historian. He claimed he was researching ghost towns in the area and asked if anyone knew about the history of Hollow Pines. The locals weren't thrilled. Hollow Pines wasn't exactly the kind of place that welcomed newcomers. At the general store, Edward was met with tight smiles and quick glances exchanged behind his back. He tried chatting with the cashier, a wiry old man named Walter, who'd lived in the town for over 60 years. "Can't say there's much history here," Walter said, not looking up as he bagged Edward's groceries. "Every town has a story," Edward replied with a smile. Walter paused, his hand hovering over a loaf of bread. "Some stories are best left untold." The town's secrets, Edward was nothing if not persistent. He wandered the quiet streets, taking photos of crumbling buildings and jotting down notes. He spent hours in the town's tiny library, poring over old records that only raised more questions than answers. The earliest mention of Hollow Pines in the archives was from 1892, when it was listed as a thriving lumber town. But something odd happened around 1910. The population plummeted by nearly half with no explanation. By 1920, the census records stopped entirely. The librarian, a jittery woman named Marla, grew visibly uncomfortable when Edward asked about it. "People don't really talk about the old days," she said, her voice low. Edward pressed on. "Why not? Something must have happened." Marla shook her head. "All I know is the woods don't like strangers. Best to keep your questions to yourself." The murmuring woods. That night, Edward couldn't sleep. The motel room was stifling, and every noise outside set him on edge. Around midnight, he decided to take a walk to clear his head. The town was eerily silent, the only light coming from the pale glow of the moon. He found himself drawn toward the woods at the edge of town, the same woods the locals seemed to avoid mentioning. As he stepped beneath the canopy of towering pines, the air grew colder. The trees seemed impossibly tall, their branches knitting together to block out the sky. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the crunch of leaves beneath his boots. Then he heard it, a faint whisper. At first he thought it was the wind, but the sound grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just a whisper, it was many voices, overlapping in a hushed cacophony. Edward spun around, shining his flashlight into the shadows. The beam caught movement, something darting between the trees too fast to follow. "Hello?" he called out, his voice trembling. The whispers stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. A warning ignored. Edward stumbled back to the motel, his heart pounding. The next morning, he tried to tell Walter what he'd experienced. "You went into the woods?" Walter's face turned ashen. "You're a damn fool. Those woods aren't safe." "What's out there?" Edward demanded. "I heard something, saw something." Walter leaned in close, his voice barely above a whisper. "This town ain't normal. Never has been. The woods, they take people, always have. That's why we don't go looking for answers." Edward refused to be deterred. He was convinced the woods held the key to Hollow Pine's mysterious history. The discovery. On his 4th day in town, Edward ventured into the woods again, this time during daylight. He followed a faint trail deeper than he had before, ignoring the uneasy feeling that settled in his chest. Eventually, he came across a clearing. At its center stood a massive tree, its trunk twisted and blackened as if struck by lightning. Surrounding the tree were crude wooden markers, each bearing a name carved into the bark. Edward counted over 30 markers. The whispers began again, louder this time, as if the air itself were alive. The names on the markers seemed to pulse and writhe under his gaze. He took a step closer to the tree, his fingers brushing against the rough bark. The moment he touched it, a wave of nausea washed over him. Images flooded his mind, faces contorted in fear, hands clawing at the earth, eyes staring lifelessly into the void. Edward stumbled back, gasping for air. He barely noticed the figure watching him from the edge of the clearing. The hollow men Edward didn't make it back to the motel. The sheriff found his abandoned station wagon 2 days later, parked near the woods. The locals didn't ask questions. They knew better. But a week after Edward disappeared, Walter noticed something strange. A new marker had appeared in the clearing by the blackened tree. It bore the name Edward Finch. The whispers grew louder that night, spreading through the streets of Hollow Pines like a creeping fog. The townsfolk locked their doors and windows, refusing to look outside. In the woods, the blackened tree seemed to sway, though there was no wind, and beneath it, the ground shifted, as if something beneath the soil was stirring. A town's curse. Hollow Pines carried on as it always had, its secrets buried deep in the shadow of the forest. But the people knew better than to stray too far. On moonless nights, when the whispers grew louder and the shadows stretched longer, they would light candles in their windows and pray softly under their breath, for they knew the truth. The woods were alive, and they hungered for more. And every time a stranger came to town, the blackened tree grew stronger. Whitlock was the kind of place you drove through without noticing. A cluster of aging buildings surrounded by endless cornfields, it sat far off the highway, forgotten by time and travellers alike. The town's population hovered around 200, give or take a few when families moved or someone didn't make it through the winter. Its biggest attraction was the grain silo on Main Street, which was also its tallest building. Next to it stood the Rusted Spoon Diner, where the town's only cook could flip a pancake in one hand while pouring coffee with the other. For the people of Whitlock, life was simple, but simplicity often hides secrets. The disappearance. It started in late October, just as the leaves had turned the colour of fire. A boy named Lucas Wilkes vanished while walking home from school. The search lasted for days. The sheriff, Bill Carver, led a team of volunteers through the cornfields and the woods that bordered the town, but there was no sign of Lucas, just his backpack found at the edge of Whitlock Forest. The forest was an unsettling place. Even on the sunniest days, its canopy of ancient trees cast deep shadows, and the air smelled faintly of decay. Parents warned their children to stay away, though they rarely explained why. After Lucas disappeared, no one needed to be told twice. A new arrival. 2 weeks later, a stranger arrived in town. He introduced himself as Adam Cole, a journalist working on a story about small-town America. He was tall and lean, with a worn leather jacket and a camera slung around his neck. The townsfolk weren't thrilled about his presence. Whitlock wasn't a place that liked outsiders, especially after what had happened to Lucas. But Adam was polite and persistent, and he spent his days interviewing anyone who would talk to him. He learned about the forest, the whispered warnings, and the stories people only told after a drink or two. Tales of figures moving between the trees, of voices calling out from the shadows, and of children who wandered too far and were never seen again. Adam dismissed it as folklore, the kind of stories every small town seemed to have. But something about the way people talked, how their voices dropped and their eyes darted toward the forest, made him uneasy. The journal, while exploring the abandoned church at the edge of town, Adam found a journal hidden beneath a loose floorboard. Its leather cover was cracked with age, and its pages were filled with cramped handwriting. The journal belonged to a man named Elias Thorne, who had lived in Whitlock in the late 1800s. Elias wrote about strange occurrences in the forest, animals disappearing, shadows moving without a source, and an oppressive feeling that grew stronger with each passing year. One entry stood out. The forest takes what it is owed. The older it grows, the hungrier it becomes. We have tried to appease it, but it is never enough. The words sent a chill down Adam's spine. The Shadow Man, that night, Adam woke to a strange sound outside his motel window. It was faint, like someone whispering his name. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside, the cold air biting through his jacket. The streets were empty, but the whispers continued, leading him toward the edge of town. He stopped when he saw it, a figure standing at the tree line. It was impossibly tall, its body wrapped in shadows that seemed to ripple and shift. Its face, or where a face should have been, was a void. Adam stumbled back, tripping over his own feet. When he looked again, the figure was gone. The whispers stopped, the search for truth. The next morning, Adam confronted Sheriff Carver, demanding to know what was going on. The sheriff sighed heavily, removing his hat and rubbing his temples. "There's nothing I can tell you that'll make sense," Carver said. "This town's been dealing with, whatever this is, for longer than anyone alive can remember. It's the forest. It's always been the forest." "What happened to Lucas?" Adam asked. The sheriff didn't answer. Into the forest, determined to uncover the truth, Adam ventured into Whitlock Forest. The air grew colder the deeper he went, and the light seemed to drain away, leaving everything in shades of grey. He followed a faint trail, his flashlight barely piercing the gloom. The trees loomed like sentinels, their gnarled branches twisting into unnatural shapes. Then he saw it, a clearing with a massive oak tree at its centre. Its roots were exposed, clawing at the earth like skeletal hands. Beneath the tree, the ground was littered with bones. Adam felt a presence behind him. He turned slowly, and there it was, the Shadow Man. It didn't move, but Adam felt its gaze, cold and unyielding. The whispers returned, louder this time, filling his head with words he couldn't understand. The truth of Whitlock. Adam staggered back into town at dawn, his face pale and his hands shaking. He went straight to the diner and demanded answers from the locals who had gathered for breakfast. "The forest takes," an old woman said, her voice trembling. "Always has. It started with the settlers. They tried to clear the trees, and the forest fought back." "Fought back?" Adam asked. "They disappeared," the sheriff said. "Whole families gone without a trace. The survivors learned to leave the forest alone, but it wasn't enough. The forest wanted more, so we made a deal." Adam's stomach turned. "What kind of deal?" The sheriff looked away. "It's why Lucas is gone, and why you need to leave." The final night. That night, Adam packed his things and prepared to leave Whitlock. But as he started his car, he felt the pull of the forest as if invisible hands were dragging him back. Unable to resist, he found himself walking toward the trees. The whispers grew louder, and the shadows stretched longer, wrapping around him like a shroud. When he reached the clearing, the Shadow Man was waiting. Adam's scream echoed through the trees, but no one in Whitlock came to help. They locked their doors and closed their curtains, praying that the forest would be satisfied for a little while longer. Epilogue. The next morning, Adam's car was found abandoned on the road leading out of town. The sheriff filed a missing person report, but no one expected him to be found. A week later, a group of children playing near the forest's edge stumbled across a new trail leading into the trees. At the end of the trail was the clearing, and beneath the great oak was a fresh patch of disturbed earth. The children didn't see the Shadow Man watching them from the darkness, but they felt it. Nestled in a valley hidden by rolling hills and dense forests, the small town of Greystone was absent from most maps. Its existence was known only to those who lived there, and the rare traveller who happened upon its narrow, twisting road by mistake. Greystone had no gas station, no fast food restaurants, not even a cell tower. The town's most significant landmark was an old clock tower that had stopped working decades ago, its hands forever frozen at 3:12. The townsfolk were a quiet, insular bunch. They didn't much like outsiders, but they tolerated them. After all, everyone who passed through eventually left, if they were lucky. A detour gone wrong. On a chilly November evening, Sarah and her younger brother Max were on their way to visit family when their GPS directed them onto an unpaved road deep in the woods. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, and the pale light of the moon barely illuminated their surroundings. Tall trees flanked the narrow road, their bare branches clawing at the sky like skeletal hands. "Are you sure this is the right way?" Max asked, staring nervously out the window. "This is what the GPS says," Sarah replied, gripping the steering wheel. She didn't want to admit how uneasy she felt. The road seemed to stretch on forever, with no sign of civilization in sight. Just as she considered turning around, the trees parted, and a small cluster of dimly lit buildings appeared. A wooden sign at the town's edge read, "Welcome to Greystone, population 348. "Finally," Sarah muttered, pulling into what looked like the town square. The cobblestone streets and weathered buildings gave the place an old-fashioned charm, but something about it felt off. The strangers in the square. Sarah parked near a diner with a flickering neon sign that read, "Judy's Eats." A handful of people stood in the square, their faces pale and expressionless. They watched silently as Sarah and Max stepped out of the car. "Hi there," Sarah called out, forcing a smile. "Our GPS brought us here. Is there a gas station nearby?" A middle-aged man with a weathered face stepped forward. His voice was deep and slow, each word drawn out as if he hadn't spoken in years. "No gas station. Closest one's 20 miles back the way you came." "Great," Sarah muttered under her breath. "Well, is there a place to stay for the night? It's getting late." The man nodded toward a building with peeling paint and a faded sign that read Greystone Inn. "Room's upstairs. Judy'll set you up." "Thanks," Sarah said. As they walked toward the inn, she glanced back at the group in the square. They were still watching. The Inn Judy, a stout woman with grey-streaked hair, was waiting behind the counter. Her smile was tight, her eyes wary. "You're passing through?" she asked as she handed Sarah a key. "Yeah, just for the night," Sarah replied. "We'll head out in the morning." Judy's gaze lingered on Max. "Make sure you leave before sunrise," she said softly. Sarah frowned. "Why?" Judy's smile faltered, and she turned away without answering. Their room was sparse but clean, with 2 twin beds and a single window that overlooked the square. As Sarah unpacked, Max sat by the window, staring down at the clock tower. "Why do you think it stopped at 3:12? He asked. "Who knows? Maybe they couldn't fix it," Sarah replied. She didn't care about the clock tower. She just wanted to get some rest and leave this unsettling place as soon as possible. The clock tower's chime. At precisely 3:12 a.m., Sarah woke to the sound of a deep, resonant chime. She sat up, her heart pounding. The clock tower, broken for decades, had struck 12 times, its eerie toll echoing through the silent town. "Max?" she whispered. He wasn't in his bed. Panic surged as she searched the room, but he was gone. The window was open, the curtains fluttering in the cold night air. Sarah grabbed a flashlight and ran downstairs. The town square was empty, the cobblestones gleaming faintly under the moonlight. She called Max's name, her voice trembling, but the only response was the distant rustling of leaves. Then she saw it, a shadow moving near the clock tower. The shadow beneath the clock. The door to the clock tower creaked open as Sarah approached. The air inside was thick with dust and the scent of mildew. Wooden stairs spiraled upward, disappearing into darkness. "Max?" she called again, her voice barely above a whisper. A faint noise echoed from above, footsteps or maybe something being dragged. Clutching her flashlight, Sarah began to climb. The steps groaned under her weight, and the darkness seemed to press in from all sides. When she reached the top, she found herself in the clock's mechanism room. The gears were massive and rusted, but they were moving, grinding slowly as if struggling against time itself. And there, standing in the center of the room, was Max. He was staring at the clock's face, his back to Sarah. "Max, what are you doing?" she cried, rushing toward him. He turned slowly and Sarah froze. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and his face was pale as chalk. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, a shadowy figure emerged from behind him. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs impossibly long and thin, Its face was a void, a swirling blackness that seemed to draw the light from the room. Sarah screamed and grabbed Max's arm, yanking him away. The figure didn't move, but its presence was suffocating, like a heavy weight pressing down on her chest. She dragged Max down the stairs and out of the tower, not daring to look back. The escape. By the time they reached the inn, Max had regained some of his colour, but he was trembling and silent. Judy was waiting in the lobby, her face pale. "You shouldn't have gone to the clock tower," she said. "No one does." "What was that thing?" Sarah demanded. Judy shook her head. "We don't talk about it. Just leave, and don't look back." The road out at dawn, Sarah and Max packed their things and drove out of Greystone. The road that had trapped them the night before now seemed straight and clear, as if the town was letting them go. They didn't speak for miles, the silence between them heavy with unanswered questions. "Sarah," Max said finally, his voice small. "The shadow, it whispered my name." Sarah gripped the wheel tighter. She didn't respond. She didn't tell him that, in her dreams, the shadow had whispered hers too. The town remains Greystone, sat quietly in its hidden valley, the clock tower's hands still frozen at 3:12. The townsfolk went about their lives, pretending not to notice the shadows that moved at the edges of their vision, or the faint chimes that echoed in the night. The town always waited, and sooner or later, it always found someone new. The town of Briarwood sat nestled in a forgotten valley, far from highways or major railways. Time seemed to have passed it by, leaving the place in a perpetual state of twilight. The streets were narrow and lined with aging Victorian houses, their paint peeling and windows clouded. Few ever visited Briarwood, even fewer left to tell the tale. A wrong turn. It was supposed to be a shortcut. Chris and Lily, two friends on a weekend road trip, were on their way to the coast when they decided to bypass the main highway. Chris had insisted that the winding back roads would save time. "I swear, the map said this would lead straight to Route 9, he muttered, tapping his phone's screen as the GPS signal flickered in and out. "Yeah, well, your shortcut has us in the middle of nowhere," Lily replied, peering out at the dense forest on either side of the narrow road. The sun was setting, casting long shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Just as they were about to turn back, the trees parted to reveal a small wooden sign. "Welcome to Briarwood. Population 413. "See? A town," Chris said, his tone triumphant. "Population 400, Lily muttered. "Bet they don't even have a gas station." But the car was running low on fuel, and neither of them wanted to risk breaking down in the woods at night. They drove into the town centre, where a single street lamp flickered weakly over a small square. There was a general store, a diner, and a few scattered houses, but no gas station. Chris parked the car and killed the engine. "Let's ask someone for directions," he said. The diner. The diner's neon sign buzzed faintly. Marge's Cafe. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and something metallic. A lone waitress stood behind the counter, her back to the door. She didn't turn when they entered. "Hi," Chris said hesitantly. We're kind of lost. Is there a gas station nearby?" The waitress turned slowly, revealing a gaunt face and hollow eyes that seemed to look through them rather than at them. "No gas station," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Not anymore." Lily frowned. "Not anymore? What's that supposed to mean?" The waitress didn't answer. Instead, she pointed to a booth in the corner. "You should sit. Have a meal before you go." Chris and Lily exchanged a glance, but the growling in their stomachs made the decision for them. They slid into the booth as the waitress brought over 2 cups of coffee, both of which smelled faintly off. "We're just passing through," Lily said, trying to sound casual. "What's the quickest way to Route 9? The waitress tilted her head, her thin lips curling into a faint smile. "Quickest way? Through the woods, but you won't want to go there." "Why not?" Chris asked, his curiosity piqued. The waitress's smile widened. "The woods don't let go." A fading light. Unsettled, Chris and Lily decided to leave. As they stepped outside, the air seemed colder than before. The town square was empty, the buildings dark and lifeless. Even the car seemed out of place, its modern lines clashing with the old-fashioned surroundings. "We're leaving," Lily said firmly, climbing into the passenger seat. Chris turned the key, but the engine sputtered and died. He tried again. Nothing. Great, Lily muttered, glancing around nervously. Now what? Chris spotted a man standing at the edge of the square, leaning against a street lamp. His face was hidden in shadow, but he raised a hand in greeting. Maybe he can help, Chris said, stepping out of the car. Lily grabbed his arm. Don't. Something's not right here. Chris shook her off. We don't have a choice. He approached the man, but as he got closer, the figure straightened and stepped into the light. His face was pale and expressionless, his eyes black pits that seemed to swallow the dim glow around them. You need to leave, the man said, his voice low and hollow, before the lights go out. The fading town. Chris backed away, stumbling over his words. What do you mean? The car? Go, the man interrupted, his tone urgent. Run. Before Chris could respond, the street lamp flickered and went dark. A chill ran through the air, and an unnatural silence fell over the town. Chris, Lily yelled from the car. Get back here. Chris turned and ran, but as he reached the car, something moved in the shadows. Shapes, tall and angular, emerged from the darkness. Their limbs were too long, their movements jerky and unnatural. The first figure stepped into the faint moonlight, revealing a face that was all wrong. It had no features, just a smooth expanse of pale skin where its eyes and mouth should have been. Get in the car, Lily screamed. Chris yanked the door open and jumped inside. The creatures advanced slowly, their movements almost hypnotic. Try it again, Lily shouted. Chris turned the key, and the engine roared to life. He floored the gas, the tires squealing as they tore out of the square. The figures didn't follow, but their hollow faces lingered in the rearview mirror. The woods. The road out of Briarwood was narrow and winding, the trees pressing in on either side. Chris drove as fast as he dared, but the headlights seemed to do little against the oppressive darkness. They're following us, Lily whispered, her voice trembling. Chris glanced in the rearview mirror and saw them, shadowy figures darting between the trees, always just out of sight. The whispers started then, soft at first but growing louder. They weren't words, just a low, guttural sound that seemed to come from the forest itself. Don't stop, Lily said, gripping the dashboard, no matter what. The final light. As they rounded a sharp curve, the headlights illuminated something in the road. A figure standing still, arms outstretched. Chris slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop. Don't get out, Lily said, her voice shaking. Please. But Chris couldn't help himself. He stepped out, and as he did, the figure turned. It was the waitress from the diner, her face now twisted into an unnatural grin. You can't leave, she said. No one leaves Briarwood. The car's engine sputtered and died again, the lights flickering. In the woods, the shadows began to move closer, their hollow faces emerging from the trees. Lily screamed, but the sound was drowned out by the whispers, now deafening. The town that keeps them, Chris and Lily were never seen again. Briarwood remains, hidden in its forgotten valley, waiting for the next travellers to take a wrong turn. Those who stumble upon it are always greeted with faint whispers in the wind, a reminder of those who came before. And the population sign? It always stays the same. Welcome to Briarwood, population 413. Nestled among the rolling hills of the Midwest, Hickory Creek was the kind of small town that barely made it on most maps. Its dusty main street was lined with old brick buildings, their facades fading under the relentless sun. The clock tower in the town square had stopped working years ago, but the townspeople had long ago stopped noticing. Hickory Creek was the kind of place where time moved differently. For some, it felt like time never moved at all. A stranger in town, Lena Anders, was driving through the countryside when her car began to sputter. She had been on the road for hours trying to make her way to a distant relative's house for a weekend visit, but her car had other plans. After pulling over and checking the engine, Lena realized it was going to take longer to fix than she expected. Her phone was useless out here, no signal, and with night approaching, the only option was to find shelter in the nearby town. She drove toward Hickory Creek, the faded sign marking the entrance. The streets were empty, the wind sweeping through the old trees that lined the roads. It was eerily quiet, but Lena didn't think much of it. Small towns like this often felt deserted, especially on a Friday night. She parked her car near the town's general store, the only business open this late. The lights inside were dim, but it appeared to be a welcoming place. Lena walked in, hoping to find help with her car or at least directions to the nearest motel. The bell above the door jingled as she entered, and the scent of tobacco and old wood hit her. The store was lined with shelves of canned goods, old-fashioned toys, and weathered books. An elderly man stood behind the counter, his thick glasses perched on his nose. "You need something, miss?" he asked, his voice rough and gravelly. "I'm having car trouble," Lena said, trying to hide her nervousness. "I was hoping someone here could help me or maybe point me to a mechanic." The man nodded slowly. "Mechanic's gone for the day. You could wait until tomorrow, but I reckon you'll be better off spending the night here." He gestured toward a small rickety chair near the back. "Not many folks travel through Hickory Creek after dark. Best to stay in until morning." Lena glanced out the window at the darkening sky. There was something about the way the man said it that didn't sit right with her, but she smiled politely. "I'd appreciate it. Thanks." The man didn't speak again, and Lena settled into the chair by the window, gazing out into the empty streets. She felt a twinge of unease, but it was nothing more than the discomfort of being in an unfamiliar place. Eventually, she dozed off. Strange noises. Lena awoke to the sound of a door creaking open. She looked up, expecting to see the old man, but instead a group of people had entered the store. They were all dressed in dark, worn clothes, their faces gaunt and pale, their eyes hollow. They didn't look at her, just moved quietly toward the counter, whispering to the elderly man. The man glanced at Lena, then back at the newcomers. "You're staying then?" he asked in a low voice. One of the figures, a woman with dark, hollow eyes, nodded. "We don't leave after dark. We wait until it's time." Lena felt a chill run down her spine. The woman's voice was unsettling, flat, as if she was reciting something she had memorized. Lena stood up slowly, her heart racing. "I think I'll just go wait in my car," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. The man didn't stop her, but the others turned their eyes toward her. Their stares were unblinking, as though they could see straight through her. Lena felt her breath catch in her throat. Something was very wrong. She backed away toward the door, her steps quickening, but as soon as she reached for the handle, the bell above the door jingled again, and Lena froze. Outside, the streets were darker than they had been before. A thick fog had rolled in, creeping along the ground like a living thing, and in the distance something moved in the fog, shapes that appeared to be people, standing motionless, watching. Lena didn't hesitate. She bolted out the door, her shoes slapping against the pavement. She didn't know where she was going, just that she needed to get out. The fog closed in around her, swallowing the light from the street lamp behind her. She looked back, and the figures from the store were standing in the doorway, staring at her. The woman's hollow eyes gleamed faintly in the dark. The town that never sleeps. Lena didn't make it far before she felt the weight of the fog pressing down on her. Her legs felt heavy, as if something was pulling at her, urging her to slow down. She stumbled forward, her breaths coming in shallow gasps, her panic growing with every step. Then she saw it, a building looming out of the fog. It was an old church, its tall steeple reaching toward the sky. The door was slightly ajar. Without thinking, Lena ran inside. The interior of the church was dim, the air stale with the scent of mildew. The pews were old and covered in dust, and the altar at the front was bare except for a single candle burning in the center. Lena hurried to the back of the church, hoping for some escape. She could hear the distant sound of footsteps approaching, heavy, deliberate. And then she saw it, a door hidden behind a velvet curtain. Her heart raced as she moved toward it, her hand shaking as she grasped the handle. She pulled the door open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. With no other choice, Lena descended into the cold, damp basement. The steps creaked under her weight, and the air grew colder with each step. She reached the bottom, and as she stepped into the room, she froze. There, in the dim light, were dozens of wooden chairs arranged in a circle, and in the center of the circle stood a figure, a man, his back to her, staring at something Lena couldn't see. "Who are you?" Lena whispered, her voice hoarse. The man didn't answer. Instead, he slowly turned to face her, his eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. His lips curled into a smile that was more of a grimace, revealing teeth that were unnaturally sharp. "We wait," he said, his voice cold and empty. "We wait for the others." Lena took a step back, her chest tightening in fear. Wait for what? For the hollow to come. Before she could react, the door slammed shut behind her, and she was plunged into darkness. The only sound was the distant echo of footsteps on the floor above her. A new beginning. The next morning, the fog was gone. The sun hung high in the sky, and the streets of Hickory Creek were empty, just as they had been the night before. The general store was closed, and no one was around to explain where Lena had gone. Some say Lena left that morning, but no one saw her leave. The people of Hickory Creek just went about their business, waiting for the next traveler who would find themselves lost in the fog. And those who stay too long in Hickory Creek, they say, never leave. Ashwood Creek was the kind of town most people forgot existed. Tucked deep in the heart of a misty forest, it clung to its traditions like a shipwrecked sailor to driftwood. The population never broke 500, and the same families had lived there for generations. The town square had a single diner, a barber shop, and a general store that hadn't changed its inventory since the 1950s. Ashwood Creek's isolation wasn't just geographical. The people kept to themselves, never venturing too far from the woods that surrounded them. Travelers rarely came through, and when they did, they never stayed long. Something about the place just felt off. One of Ashwood Creek's oldest legends was the story of the Lantern Man, a spectre said to wander the woods on moonless nights, carrying a dim, flickering lantern. The story went that anyone who saw the Lantern Man's light was cursed to disappear before dawn. The townsfolk told it as a warning to keep children from straying too far from home. But the truth behind the Lantern Man was far darker than anyone dared to admit. A new arrival. It was late October when a stranger came to Ashwood Creek. His name was Thomas Grayson, a journalist from Chicago. He was writing a book about small-town legends and had heard whispers of the Lantern Man from an old article buried in a library archive. Thomas pulled into town in a dusty blue sedan, his trunk packed with notebooks, tape recorders, and cameras. At first glance, Ashwood Creek seemed like any other fading rural town. The people were polite but wary, their eyes darting to the forest whenever the subject of his book came up. At the diner, he struck up a conversation with Clara, a waitress in her early 60s with a weathered face and kind eyes. "You're better off forgetting about the Lantern Man," Clara said, pouring him a cup of coffee. "It's not just some ghost story. People here believe in it." "That's exactly why I'm here," Thomas replied, his notebook already open. "Every legend has a kernel of truth. I want to know what yours is." Clara hesitated, glancing around the nearly empty diner. "If you're smart, you'll leave before night falls. The woods here aren't safe after dark." The first light. Thomas wasn't one to scare easily. That night he drove to the edge of the forest with a flashlight and his camera. The air was heavy with mist, and the towering trees seemed to close in on him as he walked deeper into the woods. He didn't believe in ghosts, but the silence unnerved him. There were no crickets, no rustling leaves, just the sound of his own footsteps crunching on the forest floor. After about an hour, he saw it, a faint, flickering light in the distance. Thomas's heart raced. He raised his camera and zoomed in, but the light seemed to dance and shift, always just out of focus. He followed it, weaving through the trees, the flashlight in his hand trembling slightly. The closer he got, the colder the air became. His breath puffed in white clouds, and the mist thickened until he could barely see. But the light never grew any brighter, always staying just far enough ahead to lure him deeper. Then it disappeared. Thomas stood still, his flashlight scanning the woods. The beam caught something, a figure standing just beyond the reach of the light. It was tall and thin, its face obscured by shadow. In its hand it held an old lantern, its flame barely a spark. "Who's there?" Thomas called, his voice cracking. The figure didn't move. Warnings ignored. The next morning, Thomas woke up in his motel room, unsure how he'd gotten back. His clothes were damp with dew and his camera was missing. He spent the day asking around town, but no one would talk to him about the Lantern Man. Clara finally pulled him aside at the diner. "You saw it, didn't you?" Thomas hesitated, then nodded. "I don't know what it was, but I saw something, and now my camera's gone." Clara's face paled. "You need to leave. Now. Once the Lantern Man finds you, he doesn't stop." Thomas scoffed. "Come on, it's just a story. Probably some local playing a prank." Clara grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "It's not a prank. People disappear, Thomas. My brother saw the lantern when we were kids. He went missing the next night. They never found his body. The vanishing that evening, Thomas returned to the woods, determined to find answers. This time he brought a stronger flashlight, a compass, and a second camera. The forest felt different. The trees seemed taller, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. The mist was thicker, swirling around him like living smoke. He walked for hours, the compass needle spinning wildly. Then, just as before, he saw the light. "All right, let's see who you really are," he muttered, gripping the camera tightly. The light led him deeper and deeper until he stumbled into a clearing. At its center was an old well, its stones crumbling and covered in moss. The lantern hung from a rusted hook beside it, its flame impossibly dim. There was no figure this time, just the lantern, swaying gently as if moved by an unseen hand. Thomas approached cautiously, his camera rolling. He reached out to touch the lantern, and the flame flared brightly, bathing the clearing in an eerie golden light. A voice echoed around him, soft and mournful. "You shouldn't have come." The truth of the Lantern Man. The next morning, Thomas's car was found abandoned on the side of the road. The people of Ashwood Creek didn't ask questions. They'd seen it happen before. The sheriff led a half-hearted search, but no one expected to find him. The woods had claimed another soul. Months later, a hiker stumbled across a rusted camera near an old well deep in the forest. The footage was damaged, but a single frame was clear. Thomas standing in the clearing, his face pale with terror as shadowy hands reached for him from the darkness. Ashwood Creek's secret. The townsfolk knew the truth but never spoke of it. The Lantern Man wasn't a ghost. He was a guardian, a warning. The woods around Ashwood Creek were alive, hungry for those who ventured too far. And the Lantern Man, he wasn't leading people to safety. He was leading them to their doom. To this day, on moonless nights, the people of Ashwood Creek lock their doors and draw their curtains. And if they see a flickering light in the woods, they whisper a prayer and turn away. For once the Lantern Man finds you, there's no escape. Nestled in the rolling hills of New England, Black Hollow was a town so small and isolated it seemed untouched by time. The streets were cobblestone, the houses wood-panelled with shutters that creaked in the wind, and the town square was dominated by a massive oak tree that locals called Old Harrow. Black Hollow wasn't a town of welcome mats and open arms. Visitors rarely came, and when they did, they left quickly, unsettled by the strange feeling that the town was watching them. The people of Black Hollow were polite but distant, always cautious about who they let in. But there was a reason for their wariness. Black Hollow had a history. The missing year. In the summer of 1893, something happened in Black Hollow, something no one could explain. For an entire year, the town seemed to vanish. Travellers passing through the area reported finding nothing but overgrown fields and empty roads where Black Hollow should have been. Then, just as mysteriously, the town reappeared. A caravan of traders stumbled across it one morning, its streets bustling as if nothing had happened. When questioned, the townsfolk claimed they had no memory of the missing year. To them, time had passed as usual. The strange event was never solved, and Black Hollow's residents avoided discussing it. But the town was never the same after that. The arrival in the fall of 1972, a young schoolteacher named Clara Wills moved to Black Hollow. Fresh out of college, Clara had accepted a position at the town's small schoolhouse, eager to escape the noise and chaos of the city. From the moment she arrived, Clara sensed that Black Hollow was different. The air felt heavier, and the shadows seemed to linger a little too long. But the children were polite, if unusually quiet, and the townsfolk were friendly enough, though they avoided eye contact when she asked too many questions about the town's past. One evening, as Clara was unpacking in her rented cottage, she noticed a strange symbol carved into the wooden frame of the front door. It looked like an eye, encircled by jagged lines. When she asked her landlord about it, an older man named Mr. Harron, he stiffened. "Just an old tradition," he said, his voice tight. "Keeps the bad things out." "What bad things?" Clara pressed, but Mr. Harron simply shook his head. "Best not to ask." The Whispering Oak. Clara quickly learned that the town's children avoided Old Harrow, the massive oak tree in the town square. Though it was the obvious choice for games or shade, none of the kids would go near it. One day during recess, Clara asked a boy named Sam why the tree was off limits. Sam glanced nervously at the tree before whispering, "It's where they watch us." "Who watches you?" Sam didn't answer. That night, Clara dreamed of the tree. In her dream, its gnarled branches stretched out like skeletal arms, and its shadow swallowed the entire town. She woke with a start, her heart racing. The forgotten faces. As the weeks passed, Clara began to notice odd things about Black Hollow. The townsfolk seemed to avoid being outside after dark. The windows of every house were covered with heavy curtains, and the streets were eerily silent by nightfall. She also realized that there were no elderly residents in Black Hollow. Everyone she met was either middle-aged or younger. When she mentioned this to her neighbor, a woman named Mrs. Peake, the woman's face darkened. "Don't look for answers, dear," she said quietly. "This town has a way of punishing curiosity." The figure in the fog. One chilly October evening, Clara stayed late at the schoolhouse grading papers. By the time she packed up to leave, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and a thick fog had rolled in, shrouding the streets. As she walked home, she felt a prickling sensation on the back of her neck, as if someone were watching her. She turned, but the street behind her was empty. Then she saw it, a shadowy figure standing beneath Old Harrow. Its outline was indistinct, but its eyes gleamed faintly in the fog. "Hello," Clara called, her voice trembling. The figure didn't move. Clara quickened her pace, her breath coming in shallow gasps. When she glanced back again, the figure was gone. The truth of Black Hollow. Determined to find answers, Clara began digging into the town's history. She searched the schoolhouse's attic, which doubled as an archive, combing through dusty ledgers and old diaries. What she found chilled her to the bone. An entry in a journal dated 1893 described a town meeting held just days before the missing year. The writer spoke of strange figures appearing in the woods around Black Hollow, their bodies wrapped in shadows that seemed alive. The townsfolk had tried to fight them, but the figures couldn't be touched. Desperate, they turned to an old ritual, one they claimed would protect the town, but at a cost. The journal ended abruptly, the final page torn out. The night they came. On Halloween night, Clara woke to the sound of whispers. At first, she thought it was the wind, but the voices grew louder, echoing through the walls of her cottage. She pulled back the curtains and froze. The streets were filled with figures, tall, faceless beings cloaked in shadows. They glided silently toward the square, converging around Old Harrow. Clara's heart pounded as she watched the townsfolk emerge from their homes, their faces pale and resigned. They moved like sleepwalkers, gathering beneath the tree. From her window, Clara saw Mr. Harron and Mrs. Peake among them. "Not again," Mr. Harron murmured, his voice carrying faintly through the night. Then the figures raised their arms, and the shadows beneath Old Harrow began to writhe. The cost of survival. The next morning, the streets were empty. Clara searched the town, but there was no sign of the figures, or the townsfolk. When she reached Old Harrow, she saw them, faces etched into the bark of the tree. Mr. Harron, Mrs. Peake, Sam, all of them were there, their expressions frozen in terror. Clara fled Black Hollow that day, driving until the town disappeared in her rearview mirror. Years later, she would try to tell her story, but no one believed her. Black Hollow wasn't on any map, and no records of the town existed. But Clara never forgot the faces on the tree, or the shadowy figures that still haunted her dreams. Epilogue. Some say the shadow of Black Hollow still lingers, hidden deep in the hills of New England. Travelers passing through the area sometimes report strange dreams of a massive oak tree and whispers in the wind. And on moonless nights, if you listen closely, you might hear them too. The watchers are always waiting. The town of Whispering Hollow sat nestled in the shadow of ancient Appalachian mountains, its narrow streets tangled like veins through a body long forgotten. By day, it was a quiet town, its residents polite and reserved. But at night, a heavy silence draped over the streets, suffocating sound and light alike. People rarely ventured out after dark. They said the shadows in Whispering Hollow had a way of watching you back. For decades, Whispering Hollow's story was the same. People came, people left, and the town's population never grew or dwindled by much. But in 1979, something changed. The newcomer, the Garrett family, moved to Whispering Hollow from Cincinnati. Mark and Emily Garrett, a young couple with their 6-year-old daughter Ellie, had decided to escape the city's chaos for a simpler life. They bought the old Baxter house on the outskirts of town, a towering Victorian with peeling paint and a yard choked by. From the moment they arrived, the townsfolk greeted them with tight-lipped smiles and, "You sure about that house?" asked Mrs. Daly, the grocer, one morning. Her voice trembled slightly, though she tried to keep it light. The Baxters didn't stay long, and the folks before them didn't. Mark waved her off. "Just city superstitions. The place needs work, but it's got charm." That night, as Emily tucked Ellie into bed, she caught the little girl staring at the window with a furrowed brow. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Emily asked. Ellie didn't answer immediately. Then, in a soft voice, she said, "There's a girl outside. She keeps asking to come in." Emily's chest tightened, but she forced a smile. "There's no one outside, honey. It's just your imagination." Ellie didn't argue. She just rolled over, muttering, "She said you wouldn't believe me." The girl in the yard. The next morning, Mark found Ellie sitting cross-legged in the overgrown backyard, whispering to someone who wasn't there. "Who are you talking to?" he asked, trying to keep his voice playful. Ellie looked up, her eyes wide and innocent. "Her name's Daisy. She lives here too." Mark frowned. "Daisy, huh? Is she your new imaginary friend?" Ellie shook her head firmly. "No, Daddy. She's real. She's sad because no one listens to her." Mark glanced around the empty yard. The hairs on his neck stood on end, but he forced a laugh. "Well, maybe Daisy should come inside for breakfast." Ellie giggled and ran ahead, but Mark lingered, staring at the shadowed corners of the yard, the whispering starts. The nights in Whispering Hollow grew darker. The moonlight barely touched the streets, and an unnatural chill crept into the air. The Garretts began to notice odd things around the house. Doors they swore they'd closed swinging ajar, the faint scent of lilacs lingering in empty rooms, and the distant sound of a child's laughter echoing down the hall when Ellie was fast asleep. One night, Mark woke to a faint tapping at the bedroom window. He froze, his heart pounding. Their bedroom was on the second floor. Emily stirred beside him. "What is it?" "Stay here," he whispered, grabbing the baseball bat he'd stashed under the bed. He approached the window slowly, his pulse hammering in his ears. When he pulled back the curtain, he saw nothing but the gnarled branches of the old oak tree swaying in the wind. But just as he turned to leave, he heard it. A voice so soft it was almost inaudible. "Let me in." Mark didn't sleep the rest of the night. Ellie's warnings, Ellie's conversations with Daisy became more frequent. She started telling her parents strange things. "Daisy says the shadows here are alive," she announced one morning over breakfast. Emily frowned. "That's enough about Daisy, Ellie. She's not real." Ellie slammed her spoon on the table, her face red with frustration. "She is real, and she says you have to listen or they'll come for you too." "Who will come for us?" Mark asked, trying to keep his voice calm. Ellie's lips quivered. "The Hollow people. They live in the dark, and they don't like it when you don't listen." Mark and Emily exchanged worried glances. The basement door one stormy evening, as rain lashed against the windows and thunder shook the house, Ellie screamed from her room. Mark and Emily raced upstairs, finding her huddled in the corner, her tiny hands covering her ears. "She's mad at you," Ellie sobbed. "You don't believe me, and now she's mad." Before they could console her, a loud bang echoed from downstairs. Mark grabbed the bat again and crept toward the noise, Emily close behind. The sound had come from the basement door, which now hung open, revealing a yawning black void. "Did you leave that open?" Emily whispered. Mark shook his head, his grip tightening on the bat. From the darkness, a faint voice floated up. "Come play with us, Ellie. The Hollow people." Over the following days, the whispers grew louder, invading every corner of the house. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, slithering across the walls even in the absence of light. The Garretts tried to leave, but their car wouldn't start, and no one in town seemed willing to help. One night, as the clock struck midnight, the whispers became a cacophony, and the house trembled as if alive. Ellie stood at the top of the stairs, her eyes wide and unblinking. "They're here," she said simply. The front door creaked open, revealing the blackness beyond. From the shadows emerged figures, tall, thin and faceless, their bodies made of swirling darkness. Mark grabbed Ellie, pulling her close, but she didn't resist. She stared at the figures with a strange calmness. "They just want someone to listen," she said softly. The end of Whispering Hollow. When the sun rose the next morning, the Garrett house stood empty. The townsfolk, curious but wary, peeked through the windows. The furniture was untouched, the breakfast dishes still on the table. But there was no sign of Mark, Emily, or Ellie. The only thing left behind was a child's drawing taped to the refrigerator, a crude sketch of a tall, dark figure holding hands with a little girl. Beneath it, in Ellie's handwriting, were the words, "We're happy now." No one moved into the Garrett house again. Whispering Hollow remained silent, its shadows longer and darker than ever. And if you stand outside the old Baxter house on a quiet night, you might hear it, faint whispers carried on the wind. "Let us in." Nestled in the remote hills of the Midwest, Whispering Pines was a town few outsiders knew existed. Encircled by dense forests and cut off by an aging railway line, the town was a relic of a bygone era. Its sagging porches and rusting mailboxes whispered of lives long forgotten, but the people who still lived there carried on quietly, seemingly untouched by the passage of time. Most who stumbled upon Whispering Pines didn't linger long. There was something about the town that made you feel unwelcome, as if the trees themselves wanted you gone. But for those who stayed, leaving wasn't an option. A town that wasn't on the map. Emily Carter was a freelance photographer, traveling cross-country in search of inspiration for her latest project. She specialized in abandoned places, capturing the haunting beauty of decay. When her car's GPS led her down a winding dirt road toward Whispering Pines, she thought she'd struck gold. The town wasn't on her map, but its desolation had an eerie charm. She parked in the center of what passed for a main street, her eyes scanning the crumbling facades of an old general store, a post office, and a diner with a faded sign that read, "Maud's Place." Stepping out of her car, Emily felt the air grow heavy, as if the town was holding its breath. Still, she grabbed her camera and began snapping photos. The peeling paint, the sagging roof lines, everything was perfect. But as she framed a shot of the diner's front door, she caught movement in her peripheral vision. Turning quickly, she saw a figure standing in the window of the general store, watching her. Strange hospitality. "Hello?" Emily called, her voice echoing through the empty street. The figure didn't respond. It was a woman, her face pale and expressionless, her hands resting on the glass. After a moment, the woman turned and disappeared into the shadows of the store. Emily hesitated, then decided to follow. The general store was dark inside, its shelves lined with dust-covered jars and faded boxes. The air smelled of mildew and something metallic. "Hello?" she called again. A soft voice answered from the back of the store. "You shouldn't be here." Emily froze. The voice belonged to the woman she'd seen in the window. She was standing at the far end of the aisle, her eyes sunken and her hair a mess of grey tangles. "I'm just passing through," Emily said, forcing a smile. "I'm a photographer. Thought I'd document the town." The woman stared at her for a long moment. "You should leave, before it gets dark." Emily felt a chill creep up her spine. "Why?" But the woman didn't answer. Instead, she turned and walked deeper into the shadows, disappearing through a door that creaked shut behind her. The clock that ticks backward, unnerved but curious, Emily decided to explore more of the town. She wandered past boarded-up houses and rusting cars, eventually finding herself in front of a church. Its steeple leaned precariously, and the stained glass was shattered, but the front doors were ajar. Inside, the church was in disarray. Broken pews were scattered across the floor, and the altar was covered in strange symbols carved into the wood. Above the altar hung an old clock, its hands moving steadily, backward. Emily raised her camera, snapping a shot of the bizarre timepiece. As she lowered it, she heard a faint whisper, so soft she thought it might be the wind. But then it came again, clearer this time. Her name. The Whispers in the Pines. Emily turned sharply, but the church was empty. Heart pounding, she backed out of the building and into the fading light of dusk. The forest loomed at the edge of town, its dark pines swaying gently in the breeze. The whispers followed her as she walked, faint and indistinct, but undeniably there. They seemed to come from the trees, as if the forest itself was speaking. "Emily," she stopped in her tracks, cold sweat trickling down her neck. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The only reply was the sound of pine needles rustling in the wind. Nightfall. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Emily realized she needed to leave. She hurried back to her car, only to find the battery dead. Frustrated, she grabbed her phone, but it had no signal. She tried not to panic as she scanned the empty street for help. The woman from the general store was standing on the porch now, watching her again. Emily ran toward her. "Please," she said, "my car won't start. Is there someone in town who can help?" The woman didn't respond. Instead, she gestured toward the forest. "What?" Emily asked, confused. "They'll help you," the woman said cryptically, her voice barely above a whisper. Before Emily could ask what she meant, the woman stepped back inside, shutting the door. The figures in the forest. Against her better judgment, Emily decided to follow the woman's advice. She grabbed her flashlight and headed toward the forest. The trees seemed to close in around her as she walked, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. The whispers grew louder. "Emily, Emily." She shone her flashlight wildly, but the beam barely penetrated the darkness. Then she saw them, figures standing between the trees. They were tall and thin, their faces obscured by shadow. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice shaking. The figures didn't answer. Instead, they began to move closer, their movements slow and deliberate. The truth of whispering pines. Emily turned and ran, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The forest seemed endless, the trees stretching on forever. She tripped over a root and fell hard, her flashlight skidding away. When she looked up, one of the figures was standing over her. Its face was a void, a swirling blackness that seemed to pull her in. The whispers grew deafening, filling her mind with a cacophony of voices. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the dark. A new arrival. When Emily woke, she was lying on the steps of the church. The town was quiet, the first light of dawn breaking over the hills. Her camera was gone, her car now running as if nothing had happened. She didn't question it. She drove away as fast as she could, leaving Whispering Pines behind. But as she reached the highway, she realized her camera wasn't the only thing missing. Her reflection in the rearview mirror was wrong. Her eyes looked hollow, her skin too pale. And somewhere, deep in the forest of Whispering Pines, the whispers called her name again.